Hi everyone, welcome back to Rachel's studio, and in today's video I'm going to tell you all about milk consistency paint, which I'm really excited about this consistency because I've been doing some new experiments with it that are really exciting and really can add some glow and some beautiful watercolor effects to your painting. So in today's video we're going to talk about what is milk consistency paint, how do you mix it, a little simple demo on how to get the basic brush strokes, and then I'll show you some real footage of actual paintings where I'm using milk consistency paint, and we will progress through several techniques from more beginner oriented techniques all the way up to more advanced, really fun, exciting techniques. So let's go ahead and get started. So first of all, let's talk about what is milk consistency paint. The way that you mix milk consistency paint is you add a medium amount of water with a medium amount of paint. With tea consistency paint, you add a lot of water. It's really watery. But with milk consistency paint, if you mix your paint and you tilt your palette up, it will bead, but it won't drip. At least it won't drip readily. And tea consistency paint will drip readily. Cream consistency paint won't move at all. So that's the difference between the three basic paint consistencies. And by the way, I do also have a really good video that explains different pairings of milk, tea, cream consistencies with different levels of moisture on your paper. And I will link that here, so be sure to check that out. It's a great video. Let's watch a brief demonstration of me mixing up milk consistency paint, and I'll show you some basic brush strokes. And then after that, we will look at some in situ painting situations where you'll see me using milk consistency paint in actual paintings. So let's start off by talking about how to get your paint mix to a milk consistency thickness. So if you remember last week's video, we talked about cream consistency where you just add a little bit of water. So you can think in terms of adding a medium amount of water for milk consistency. So what that usually means for me when I'm mixing is, and I'm using my silver black velvet size 8 round. So last week, remember we dipped just the tip in to get a little bit of water to get cream consistency, although that's tea consistency, that's still too much. We're going to dip pretty much the whole brush in this time to get milk consistency, the right amount of paint on our brush to get milk consistency mix. I'm going to use French ultramarine just because I have a lot of it on my palette right now. And if you remember last week for cream consistency, the way to tell you've got cream consistency is if you tilt your palette up, it won't run, it won't bead. You can turn it upside down and it won't move. Milk consistency in general will bead but will not drip. So let's see if we can get this right the first time. All right, let's see if it passes the test, if it beads but doesn't drip. All right, it's starting to drip, but it's a slow drip. We're pretty much there. That's what I would consider milk consistency paint. Let's look at some real world examples now of using milk consistency. And just like last week, where we started on dry paper techniques, this week we will do the same because it's easier to paint on dry paper than it is to paint on wet paper. So let's paint milk consistency techniques on dry paper first. So the basic brush strokes are just a regular stroke. And you can do a dry on dry stroke with it, which is you use, instead of using the tip of your brush like this, you use the side and go fast for a more textured look like that. So that's dry on dry technique. I talked about this in the last video. It shouldn't be called dry on dry because you can do quote unquote dry on dry effect with even tea consistency paint. It just depends on how much tilt you get to your brush and how fast you go. So it should be more like fast technique because as long as you get your brush on the side and go fast, you're going to get these textures. Now let's look at some more complicated approaches to painting with milk consistency, and that's going to be your wet on wet techniques. So first you get your paper wet, and sometimes what I like to do is go back into these half dry areas and put some water and loosen them up here and there for say a fur effect or some interesting clouds. You can go back in and soften some of what you did on this wet on dry technique and it gives a really interesting effect. All right, so this is getting to be buckling. So let's pick up our paint and see what happens when we put in milk consistency on wet paper. That is what I would imagine would be a perfect way to paint clouds. And then, in fact, we can make a little, I don't know, square clouds, I don't know. As that half dries, you can go in with what I call the push technique. When if you put your finger in the paint and it makes a fingerprint and it holds its fingerprint, that means it's a good time to do cauliflower techniques, but it is not holding my fingerprint, so I'm going to wait a few more seconds. Try it again. Now it's holding my fingerprint, so I know I can go in and do some cauliflowers. I'll put a cauliflower right there on my thumbprints. I can put in some drips of clear, clean water, and it'll cauliflower beautifully and create cloud type effects. I'm going to put a bunch of water right over my thumbprint, so just clouds right out, and it makes a really pretty cloud effect. So those are the basic, straightforward, 3 basic approaches of wet on dry, dry on dry, wet on wet. All right, so that's my basic demo. Now let's get to the really fun stuff where I'm using milk consistency paint in actual paintings. I'm going to share some footage from some Patreon tutorials, which are real-time start to finish tutorials. And we will start with some more basic techniques and then move on up the ladder to more advanced, almost intuitive techniques on wet paper. So again, we're going to start with the simplest and the most straightforward way I think it is possible to paint watercolor is wet on dry, which you see me doing here. I use just the tippy tip of my brush, which is a silver black velvet, size 8 round, to get tiny hair details, and I paint in the direction of the fur. You then see me use the side of the brush and a faster brush stroke to emulate the look of sun hitting the fur, which also works great for things like sparkling water. As the paint half dries, I can layer brush strokes on top of brush strokes to continue to build texture. By the way, this is the classic way to build up both value and texture complexity in watercolor. Layers of paint that are allowed to dry in between each successive layer. Here you see me getting those 3 slightly different colored green puddles of milk consistency watercolor in preparation for some more wet on dry painting. When painting with milk consistency paint, you very rarely want to have large areas of just one color. You want to have a little variety. In this case, slightly yellow green next to slightly bluer green next to a grayer green, which, by the way, you add red to get a grayer green, and also for more natural looking greens, add a little red to your green. This is another example of the most straightforward example of wet on dry I could find in my footage archives, and I painted green in between the grass blades. And by the way, this is called negative painting, where you paint around the subject, in this case, the grass. Next, let's look at a landscape example with some dry brush techniques where I took a cheap chip brush, which you can find at any hardware store, and I boiled it to get it to kind of texture out. You can also scrub these chip brushes on cement and then apply paint with a dabbing motion, and it makes great texture. Let's listen in on some of this tutorial. And I'm going to go in to create some textures first, and I'm going to use the most raggedy part of this brush. And you're going to dot it on, and that really looks very, very grassy, doesn't it? It's a very good brush for a dry brush technique. And just dot it on. You can see how this would make really great fur. There's a little bit more pressure here. Really scrub it around and get those bristles spread out. That's really very pretty grass. It takes a little patience because you have to do a lot of dabbing. I do like how much character and movement it puts in the grass. I think that looks great. I like how unstilted this makes it look. It forces you to have a random look to your brush marks, especially if you get most of the water out, and then just gently dab on some of these textures. If you press too hard, then you get a blap. We'll call that a blap. Next is a charging technique similar to what I showed you a few weeks ago with the video about charging for zebra stripes, but with a twist. Instead of making the charged area one flat color, I put different colors next to each other, completely departing from my reference, using artistic license to create an aesthetically pleasing, abstracted look. So to achieve this look, I pre-wet the area with clean, clear water, keeping the water inside the branches. And because when you wet them, they become enclosed little areas that will hold the color in place, they present an opportunity to play with putting colors next to each other without them blooming out in an uncontrolled mess. The watercolor will only go where the water is, so you can really play with putting colors next to each other and watch them mix slightly at the edges for beautiful effects. If you remember, I also did a similar thing with my rainbow zebra I did last month, so be sure to check that out. That rainbow zebra is also available to my Patreon members with full voiceover in real time if you'd like to explore a fun way to play with color and practice your new charging skills. Super fun. Also, be sure to subscribe because next week I'll show you the tea consistency portion of these tree branches where I use several spatter techniques for a fun way to create the tree canopy. Also, if you're enjoying this video, I'd love it if you would like this video and leave me a comment so the algorithm knows you love me so I can continue to grow this channel. In most real-world situations, watercolor is not nearly as straightforward as you've seen thus far in this video. I often use a variety of techniques and a variety of paint consistencies in quick succession to achieve all kinds of outcomes. For example, the petals of the sunflower start out straightforward enough with a wet on dry technique, where I paint in the basic shape of the yellow petals, but then I quickly pick up some more orange paint and drop it into the base of the wet petals to add dimension and interest. Then I splatter on some tea consistency paint and really get the sunflower looking very dynamic. If I would have just used one or two straightforward techniques with just milk consistency paint, I would have risked having a very flat looking, medium valued painting of a sunflower. And remember, you want to make sure you get all the values represented in your painting. So that will require using a lot of different consistencies throughout the painting with a lot of different techniques most likely as well. Next, I want to show you some footage of the tutorial I call Beginner Bunny, which I kept as straightforward as possible for more beginner-oriented students wanting to learn to paint fur and animals, which my Patreon leans heavily towards, by the way, animals, and it's also a lot more advanced tutorials in general. I do have about 20 very beginner-oriented tutorials, but most of my tutorials on my Patreon are more advanced. But anyway, here I start with the ear on dry paper and paint in a basic milk consistency brown. But then, while it's still wet, I drop in more chocolate brown along the edge of the ear. I build up layers of texture by painting milk consistency dry brush over tea consistency dry brush layers. I know you often hear to let things dry completely between layers, but I didn't mind any slight cauliflowering I might be risking because fur has texture anyway, so I wasn't letting it completely dry in this particular instance. As it was, this dried pretty quickly and I was able to continue to add layers of dry brush on top of layers of dry brush to build up the fur textures. If you're interested in learning to paint fur textures, I highly recommend this tutorial, and you'll also learn a lot about painting grass and trees because it's all the same techniques. Anyway, let's look at even more complex wet and wet techniques. And this next one is what I use in almost every single painting because I can get beautiful soft transitions and edges. In this painting, I wanted a lot of soft transitions in the water. And to build up some of the darker areas of the water that are in shadow, I wet all the river with clean, clear water and then drop in milk consistency blue, which is called charging, by the way. Create a darker area of water that stays soft at the edges of the shadow. And then, while that's still all wet, I drop in thicker black paint even closer to the shoreline where I want it even darker. And I also add some soft details of reflections in another part of the water while I have everything wet. By the way, when you pre-wet your painting and then drop in paint, that is called charging. If you watched my last video about cream consistency paint, I talked about how I rarely use cream consistency paint for large areas of darks. And that is because if you use super thick black paint or a dark paint to paint a large dark area, it'll look flat and lifeless and it won't get dark enough. It's very hard to get it dark enough. So what I usually do is use milk consistency paint in several layers. So That is no different for this Labrador Retriever. You see that I have some dried black paint, and now I'm painting Windsor Violet on top of that. And I'm kind of making the edges scrumbly so it kind of blends in and doesn't look like a blob of purple on top of all that black. And then after that, you'll see me use ultramarine blue. And that's another thing I want you all to notice is that am I using yellow or cobalt blue or other colors that tend to not get too dark to build up this Black Lab's dark fur? No, I'm using darker, heavier colors like Windsor Violet, ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, burnt umber, sap green, phthalo blue. I rarely use phthalo blue though because it's so staining and I like to lift a lot, so I rarely use phthalo blue, but it is a paint that has a beautiful intense blue that can get really deep and dark, especially in glazes. But that's another thing to think about when you're using milk consistency paint to build up darks in your painting. You want to use the right colors, and there are certain paints that work better than others to build those dark layers up. All right, I would be remiss to not share this footage of this cat. And now I almost didn't share this because this is a Christmas video, but it's such a great illustration of how you can use layers of milk consistency paint to get all kinds of effects. And in the case of this painting, it was to get a really cool dramatic glow from Christmas lights. And as you watch me paint this, I'm using a mix actually of both milk consistencies and cream consistencies paint, but it is mostly milk consistency, especially that yellow and then the orange, and then in the corners where it's super dark, I did use cream consistency on wet paper, but I got all my paper wet, and then I would drop in milk consistency paint for the most part, let it dry, and then paint more milk consistency paint, let it dry, more milk consistency paint, let it dry. And this was a great way to build up slowly the values around the glow of the yellow lights. And it was fairly easy and straightforward to do. And it was all done mostly with milk consistency paint. Another place that I commonly use milk consistency paint is to balance out values towards the end of the painting process. And I can tell you, and a lot of people don't watch my tutorials to the very end, but it's at the very end when you're balancing out values that really can make or break a painting. And I encourage you to stick with your painting. So that is a very advanced technique, actually, that more advanced artists understand. They have to keep working on their painting, balancing out those values to get a good result. And often it's going to be with milk consistency paint, like you see me painting here. I'm using a calligraphy brush that gets really good textures on it. The great thing about these brushes are they're really cheap and they're natural hair, so you can get really great textures for both natural landscape work and fur, because they make really great textures. I'm using this calligraphy brush here with milk consistency burnt sienna with swishy strokes to deepen the values of the fur on parts of this mama fox's face, to getting the values balanced out and to add contouring so she looks more three-dimensional. All right, I'm gonna bring you in on the middle of the footage of me painting this background, which was so fun. This is the most fun I've had painting in forever. But I had done everything in tea consistency, so be sure to not miss how I did this background with tea consistency paint. And I'll probably release that footage next week when I release my techniques video featuring tea consistency paint. But it is going to be my birthday week, so I'm not promising anything, but I'm going to try to get that video out to you sooner rather than later. But anyway, I painted the background with tea consistency up to this point, so it was quite puddling and wet, and that's why you see all this moisture. And then I got some fresh out of the tube cobalt blue and mixed it with water, so it was really juicy milk consistency. And what I was thinking in my mind was I'm going to splash on large areas of blue as if they were trees to, one, have a splashy background, but two, also make it cohesive, so it's not just a little bit of splashes of blue everywhere. It's a big area of blue in a couple places in this background. So I splatted that milk consistency ultramarine blue on. And this is the thing with ultramarine blue, and also cobalt blue is the same way. It granulates when you use it in really watery mixes. So as this dries, it will granulate really beautifully. So that is another wonderful way to use milk consistency paint, is in a application like this, where as it dries, it'll granulate out because you're splashing it onto watery paper. And then because I was getting puddles and I didn't want it to be too watery where I splatted the milk consistency paint, I used toilet paper to blot up the puddles. And what that does is it gets the water off of your painting, but it doesn't lift much paint off. So that way you get more control of your paint so you don't get puddles of color. Instead, where you splash on the paint, they kind of maintain their shape of splashes. So they have more variety instead of just being one big puddle of just medium colored amorphous blobs of color as it dries. Thank you so much for joining me for this tutorial about all things milk consistency paint. Isn't it fun? And next week we're going to have a lot of fun because next week it'll be all about tea consistency paint. So I'm really excited to share those techniques with you. I've got a lot of good things coming. So be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of these goodies. And I will see you next time. Now go watercolor your world. Bye, everybody.